The man you saw on your television screen was calm, measured, a cigarette balanced between two fingers, smoke curling upward like a question mark. His voice carried the weight of 1,000 unspoken secrets. He welcomed you into the Twilight Zone with a half-smile that never quite reached his eyes. But when the studio lights went dark, when the cameras stopped rolling, Rod Serling was somewhere else entirely. He was back in the Philippines, back in 1945, crouched in a foxhole that smelled of mud and blood and fear, watching his best friend fall from the sky, his parachute shredded by enemy fire, his body hitting the ground like a sack of broken promises. That image never left him, not for a single day of his remaining 30 years. You invited this man into your living room every Friday night. You marveled at his genius. But did you ever notice the darkness behind those eyes? Did you ever wonder why a man who created stories about death seemed so intimately acquainted with it? This is the story they never told you. The story of a war hero who never stopped fighting. A prophet who wrote his own ending long before it arrived. A man who burned so bright he consumed himself before the world was ready to let him go. Rodman Edward Serling entered the world on December 25, 1924, in Syracuse, New York. A Christmas baby, his mother Esther called him her gift from God. She dressed him in his finest clothes every holiday and told anyone who would listen about her miracle child. But Rod would spend his entire life questioning whether any gift came without a price and what that price might ultimately be. He was small, 5'4", the kind of boy who got picked last for every team, who had to fight twice as hard for half the respect. His father Samuel, a butcher by trade, taught him that words were the only weapons a small man could carry. Rod learned to wield language like a master swordsman wields his blade, with precision, with economy, with devastating effect. By 17, he was restless beyond measure, hungry for experience. The world was at war, and Rod Serling wanted desperately to be part of something larger than himself. On his 18th birthday, the day after Pearl Harbor's first anniversary, he enlisted in the United States Army. They assigned him to the 511th Parachute Infantry Regiment, paratroopers, the men who jumped from the sky into hell, the elite, the expendable. The training was brutal. They called it jump school, but it was really a factory that manufactured either soldiers or corpses. Rod made it through. He was small, but he was fierce. The other men learned not to underestimate the kid from Syracuse, who could outright and outfight anyone in the barracks. He discovered something about himself during those months. He was not afraid of death. He was afraid of meaninglessness, of dying without having said what needed to be said. In January 1945, they shipped him to the Pacific, the Philippines, Leyte, Manila, some of the bloodiest battles of the entire war. What happened there would define every word he ever wrote for the rest of his life. Private Melvin Levy was Rod's closest friend in the regiment. They had trained together, laughed together in mess halls, shared cigarettes and dreams of what they would do when the war was over. Levy wanted to open a bookstore. Rod wanted to be a writer. They made a pact. Whoever survived would tell the other's story. On the afternoon they jumped into Tagaytay Ridge. Levy's parachute malfunctioned. Rod watched him fall. He watched his friend's body tumble through the air, arms flailing, mouth open in a scream that the wind stole before it could reach anyone's ears. He watched the impact from hundreds of feet above, helpless, still floating toward the ground himself. He watched the stillness that followed, the terrible stillness that meant everything and nothing. He landed safely. He walked to where Levy's body lay and stood there for what might have been minutes or hours. That night, crouched in a foxhole with enemy fire crackling in the distance, Rod Serling wrote his first serious story. It was about a man who watches his friend die and cannot save him, a man who carries that death inside him like a stone that grows heavier with each passing year. He would write variations of that story for the rest of his life, but Levy was not the only ghost. During the occupation of Manila, Rod witnessed things that no training could prepare a man for. Civilians caught in crossfire, children burned by explosions, a Japanese soldier, no older than Rod himself, dying slowly in a ditch, calling for his mother in a language Rod could not understand, but somehow comprehended perfectly. The Japanese soldier took 3 hours to die. Rod sat with him, unable to help, unable to leave. When it was over, he did not feel victory. He felt complicit in something monstrous. And then there was the accident that crystallized everything. During a recreational demolition exercise, soldiers letting off steam by blowing up abandoned equipment. A crate fell from a supply plane overhead. It struck a fellow soldier named Rodriguez in the head, killing him instantly. Rod was standing 3 feet away. The man's blood and brain matter spattered across his uniform, his face, his hands. It was absurd, meaningless. After surviving combat, after dodging bullets and grenades and enemy fire for months, a man was killed by a falling crate during a game. A game. The universe was laughing at them, and the joke was death itself. Rod would later write an episode of The Twilight Zone called Where Is Everybody, about a man who is completely alone in a deserted town, slowly losing his grip on reality. The critics called it brilliant science fiction, innovative storytelling, groundbreaking television. Rod knew it was something else entirely. It was a documentary of his own mind, the loneliness, the paranoia, the sense that reality itself could not be trusted. The war ended. Rod came home. But the boy who left Syracuse was not the man who returned. He looked the same, more or less, a few pounds lighter, a few years older around the eyes, but something fundamental had shifted inside him. Some essential mechanism had been damaged beyond repair. His mother noticed immediately. She mentioned it to Samuel, who said nothing but started checking on his son more frequently, as if afraid Rod might disappear. He enrolled at Antioch College in Ohio, using his GI Bill benefits. He studied literature, philosophy, psychology, anything that might help him understand what he had seen, what he had done, what had been done to him. He read Hemingway and Faulkner and Steinbeck, writers who had also seen war, and tried to make sense of it through words. But understanding was elusive. The nightmares were not. Every night, Rod returned to Tagate Ridge. Every night, he watched Levy fall. Sometimes the dream was merciful and ended before the impact. Often it was not. Every night, he woke drenched in sweat, reaching for a rifle that was no longer there, sometimes shouting orders in a voice that was not entirely his own. His roommates learned not to wake him suddenly. The results were unpredictable and sometimes violent. One roommate needed stitches after startling Rod awake. Rod had grabbed his throat before either of them understood what was happening. Rod channeled his fury into writing with a desperate intensity. He submitted scripts to radio programs, won second prize in a national contest, and discovered that he had a gift for translating the unspeakable into the speakable. The horrors that lived inside him could become stories, and stories could be shared with strangers who would never know they were receiving a confession. In 1948, he married Carol Kramer, a fellow Antioch student with dark hair and patient eyes. She was quiet where he was loud, patient where he was explosive, steady where he was erratic. She saw through his bravado immediately, saw the fear beneath the confidence, the wound beneath the scar, and loved him anyway. Perhaps because of it, she would remain his anchor for the next 27 years, through triumphs and disasters, through heart attacks and breakdowns, through battles with networks and battles with his own demons. When he woke screaming, she held him until the shaking stopped. When he raged against the censors, she listened until the fury exhausted itself. Carol understood something about Rod that most people missed entirely. Beneath the bravado, beneath the sharp wit and the sharper temper, there was a man who was terrified. Not of death, he had made his peace with death in the Philippines, but of meaninglessness, of a universe where men fell from the sky for no reason, where crates crushed skulls in the middle of a game, where all the writing in the world could not bring back a single lost friend. He needed to believe that words mattered, that stories could save people, that the suffering meant something. Carol helped him believe it as long as he could. By the early 1950s, Rod Serling had become the most honored writer in television. He won 6 Emmy Awards, a record at the time that seemed unbreakable. His teleplays, including Patton's and Requiem for a Heavyweight, were hailed as masterpieces of the new medium, proof that the glowing box in the living room could produce art as powerful as any stage play or novel. But with success came enemies, powerful enemies with corporate backing and no tolerance for controversy. Television in the 1950s was controlled by sponsors. Advertisers paid for programs, which meant advertisers decided what could and could not be said. They wanted safe, comfortable, forgettable entertainment, the kind of programming that made viewers happy enough to buy soap and cigarettes and automobiles. They did not want a small, intense man from Syracuse writing stories about racism, nuclear war, and the darkness of the human soul. Rod wanted to write about the execution of Emmett Till, a black teenager lynched in Mississippi for allegedly whistling at a white woman. It was the defining outrage of the era, a story that demanded to be told. The sponsors refused absolutely. Too controversial. It might upset Southern affiliates. He wanted to write about McCarthyism, about the madness of loyalty oaths and blacklists that were destroying innocent lives. The sponsors refused categorically. Too political. They changed his scripts without permission. They deleted lines, softened themes, removed anything that might make a viewer uncomfortable enough to stop buying soap. They took stories about lynching and turned them into stories about anonymous mob violence. Rod fought them. He screamed in meetings until his face turned red and his voice gave out. He threatened to quit so many times that his threats lost all credibility. He wrote furious letters to network executives, accusing them of cowardice and complicity in the crimes they refused to let him expose. But the sponsors always won. In the end, the sponsors always won. One night, after a particularly brutal script revision that removed every reference to racial violence from his script about racial violence, Rod came home and sat in the dark for 3 hours. Carol found him there, motionless in his chair, a cold cigarette between his fingers, staring at nothing. "They killed it," he said. His voice was flat, defeated. "They took everything real and true and made it into nothing." He was silent for a long moment. Then he looked at his wife with eyes that had seen too much death. "I need to find a way to tell the truth without them knowing I'm telling the truth. A disguise, a mask." That night, the Twilight Zone was born. The concept was elegant in its deception. Science fiction, fantasy, tales of the impossible, set on other planets and in other dimensions and in futures that might never come. No sponsor would object to a story about a man who discovers he is a robot, that was safely abstract, removed from anything real, or a town that falls under alien control, just entertainment, nothing political, or a doll that comes to life, harmless fantasy for the children. But Rod Serling knew better. Rod Serling understood that the oldest trick in the writer's arsenal is the allegory, the story that seems to be about one thing while actually being about something else entirely. Every episode of The Twilight Zone was a Trojan horse. Inside the fantastical exterior, Rod smuggled the messages he had been forbidden to tell directly. An episode about alien invaders was really about McCarthyism. An episode about a post-apocalyptic world was really about nuclear paranoia. An episode about a man who could not age was really about the loneliness of genius. The sponsors never understood what they were approving. The audience did. The Twilight Zone premiered on October 2, 1959. Rod served as creator, head writer, and host. The last role added almost as an afterthought, because the network needed someone to introduce each episode, and Rod was cheaper than hiring a professional actor. That economical decision created an icon that would outlive them all. The image of Rod Serling standing in shadow, cigarette in hand, speaking directly to the camera in that distinctive staccato rhythm, became one of the most recognizable images in television history. His voice measured and hypnotic, with deliberate pauses that made every word feel like a revelation, defined the show as much as any script. But the work nearly killed him. And then it did kill him, slowly, one cigarette at a time. During the first 3 seasons of The Twilight Zone, Rod Serling wrote 92 of the 156 episodes, 92 scripts. That is more than most writers produce in an entire career. He produced them in 3 years. The pace was inhuman. He worked 18-hour days, often starting before dawn and continuing past midnight. He smoked 4 packs of cigarettes daily, sometimes 5 when the pressure was particularly intense. He survived on coffee, anxiety, and what he later admitted were more Benzedrine tablets than I care to remember. The amphetamines kept him awake, the cigarettes kept him focused, the work kept him sane, or at least that was the bargain he made with himself. Carol watched him shrink before her eyes. The fire in his eyes was consuming the man behind them. "You're going to kill yourself," she told him. "Maybe," he replied, "but I'll leave something behind." The physical toll was obvious. Rod aged a decade in those 3 years. His face grew gaunt. His hands trembled when he lit his constant cigarettes. He developed a persistent cough that he ignored, just as he ignored the chest pains that occasionally forced him to pause mid-sentence. But the psychological toll was worse, invisible to cameras, but devastating nonetheless. Every episode required Rod to descend into darkness, to imagine worlds where men were puppets controlled by unseen forces, where reality was illusion, and illusion was the only truth, where death was not an end but a beginning of something far worse. He drew on his war experiences constantly, returning again and again to the foxhole, the falling parachute, the blood-spattered uniform. He was strip-mining his own trauma for material, and trauma is not a renewable resource. Every time he accessed those memories, he relived them. Every script cost him something that could not be replaced. In 1962, Rod suffered his first heart attack. He was 37 years old, far too young for such a thing, except that he had aged himself through chemicals and stress and sleeplessness. The doctors told him to stop smoking. He did not. They told him to reduce stress. He could not. They told him that if he continued at this pace, he would not live to see 50. He heard them, he understood them, and then he went back to his typewriter and started the next script. "I know what's coming," he told a friend after leaving the hospital. "I've known since the Philippines. Some men die in war, some men die after it. I'm just taking my time." Here is where the story becomes strange. Here is where the boundary between Rod Serling's fiction and Rod Serling's life begins to blur in ways that feel less like coincidence and more like destiny. Consider the 16mm Shrine, an episode about an aging actress who retreats into her old films, literally stepping through the screen into a past that no longer exists. Rod wrote it as a meditation on Hollywood's cruelty to those it discards. But was he also writing about himself, about the war hero who kept retreating into his own memories, living more vividly in 1945 than in 1959? Consider Walking Distance, perhaps the most personal episode of the entire series. A man named Martin Sloan returns to his hometown and discovers that he has traveled back in time to his own childhood. He tries to warn his younger self about the pain ahead, but his father stops him. "You have to leave," the father says. "This is his summer, not yours." Rod wept while writing that episode. He wept again during filming, when the actors spoke his words back to him. He wept every time he watched it for the rest of his life. And then there is Nothing in the Dark. An old woman lives alone in a basement apartment, terrified that if she opens her door, death will enter. She has barricaded herself against the world, against time, against the inevitable. A wounded policeman begs for help from outside. She lets him in, against her better judgment, because she cannot bear to let someone die on her doorstep. In the end, she discovers that the policeman is death himself, but that death is not something to fear. It is gentle. It is a release from a life that has become a prison. Rod wrote that episode in 1962, the same year as his first heart attack. Critics praised its tenderness, its wisdom, its profound acceptance of mortality. No one asked the obvious question: why was a 37-year-old man writing so beautifully about the acceptance of death? The Twilight Zone ended in 1964. The ratings had declined. The network wanted something new. Rod was exhausted, broken, a shadow of the man who had begun the series 5 years earlier. He tried other projects: Night Gallery, another anthology series that never achieved the same heights; Planet of the Apes, for which he wrote the original screenplay, including the famous Statue of Liberty ending that became one of cinema's most iconic images; various teleplays and films that were sometimes brilliant but never matched the cultural impact of his masterwork. He taught writing at Ithaca College, hoping to pass on what he had learned. His students remembered a man who was generous with his time, passionate about craft, and haunted by something they could never quite identify. He would stop mid-lecture sometimes, one student recalled, just stop, and his eyes would go somewhere else, and we knew not to say anything. We just waited until he came back. By 1975, Rod Serling had survived 3 heart attacks. His doctors had pleaded with him to retire, to stop smoking, to find some peace in his remaining years. He could not. The typewriter was the only thing that kept the ghosts at bay. Without work, there was only the foxhole, only the falling parachute, only the blood and the silence and the meaninglessness. In June of that year, Rod underwent open-heart surgery, a coronary bypass. The doctors were optimistic. The procedure had become routine, the success rates were encouraging, and Rod was only 50, still young enough to recover fully. But Rod knew. He had always known. He had written this ending years ago, in 100 different disguises. On June 28, 1975, during the surgery, Rod Serling's heart stopped. The doctors worked frantically. They shocked him. They massaged. They did everything medicine could do in 1975, everything science had learned about keeping hearts beating against their will. It was not enough. Rod Serling died on the operating table. He was 50 years old. He had been writing his own death since he was 19. The news hit the entertainment industry like a shockwave. Tributes poured in from colleagues, competitors, and the millions of viewers who had grown up with the Twilight Zone. They called him a genius, a visionary, the father of modern television drama. But Carol Serling, the quiet woman who had anchored him for 27 years, said something more profound. He wasn't running toward death, she told an interviewer. He was running from life, from what he saw in the war, from what he carried inside him every single day. Writing was the only way he knew how to survive it, and when the writing stopped, she did not finish the sentence. She did not need to. Walk into any writer's room in Hollywood today. Ask them about Rod Serling. Watch their faces change. He invented the modern television anthology. He proved that the medium could be art, not just entertainment. He demonstrated that science fiction was not escapism, but examination, a way to hold a mirror to society without society realizing it was looking at itself. The Twilight Zone has been revived 3 times since his death. Each revival tries to capture what Rod created, and each ultimately fails. Not because the writing is inferior, though it often is, but because the essential ingredient cannot be reproduced. Rod Serling wrote from a place of genuine horror. He had seen the worst humanity could do to itself. He had watched friends die for nothing. He had carried the dead inside him for 30 years. Every word he wrote was an exorcism. You cannot fake that. You cannot manufacture it in a writer's room with good intentions. You can only survive it if you are lucky, or be consumed by it if you are not. Rod Serling was not lucky, but before the consumption was complete, he left us 156 episodes of The Twilight Zone. He left us screenplays and teleplays that changed what was possible. He left us the template for every serious television drama that followed. Most importantly, he left us a warning. In one of his final interviews, Rod was asked what he wanted to be remembered for. He thought for a long moment, cigarette smoke wreathing his face. "I want people to remember that stories matter," he said. "That a man with a typewriter can change the way people think, can make them see what they refuse to see, can make them feel what they refuse to feel." He paused. His eyes went somewhere distant, somewhere the interviewer could not follow. "And maybe," he added quietly, "I want them to remember that the man who wrote about other dimensions was himself trapped in one, the dimension of memory, the dimension of war, the dimension from which there is no exit, no matter how many stories you tell." He looked directly at the interviewer. "That's the real Twilight Zone," he said, "and I've been living there since 1945. The man you saw on your television was a storyteller, but every story was a confession. Every episode was a cry for help, disguised as entertainment. Every cigarette was a surrender to the death he had been waiting for since Tagatay Ridge. He invited you into the Twilight Zone. He showed you worlds of wonder and terror. He made you think about things you preferred to ignore. But he never told you the most important truth, that he was speaking from experience, that the zone was not imaginary, that for some men, damaged men, broken men, men who watched their friends fall from the sky, there is no dimension called normal, there is only the twilight, and Rod Serling lived there every single day of his life, until the day he finally found the only exit. The next time you watch an old episode, the next time you see him step from the shadows, cigarette in hand, voice measured and mysterious, remember what you now know. Remember the paratrooper, remember the nightmares, remember the price, and perhaps for a moment you will understand why those eyes never quite smiled, why that voice carried such weight, why a man who created wonder was himself so deeply wounded. That is the untold story of Rod Serling. That is the shadow behind the Twilight Zone, and now you know.